Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also syndicated on WHIV New Orleans. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. This week, I want to kind of talk about a lot of the local races, especially with regard to Texas congressional districts, the different races going on here, and just generally the kind of different approaches to electoral organizing, kind of what's at stake, what that looks like, because I feel like there's so kind of little good information out there on what the more local races are all about. To talk about all this and more is Jacob Aronowitz. He's a DSA member, also with United Professional Organizers and Collective Campaigns. Thank you, Jacob, for coming back on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Brian.
Yeah, very glad to have you back. Before we get into kind of the nitty-gritty of specific campaigns, I'd like to just sort of get your perspective. I know you've been working on a lot. You worked for the last time around, worked for the Mike Siegel campaign a lot in kind of rural Texas, and have been on the ground a lot. So I'm wondering kind of what you've seen that just generally stands out to you about the way people are approaching some of these congressional district campaigns. How is it, is there a sense that something's kind of changing? Because I know we keep hearing, that Texas is going to quote unquote turn blue or whatnot. So I'm wondering just kind of what your perspective is on the feelings on the ground.
Well, like I said, thanks again for having me back. There's a lot of congressional races in Texas and a lot of races on the state legislative side as well that represent a real opportunity for the left and for working class people to at least make Pareto improvements over the conditions they find themselves in. So there's multiple, like, to start with the congressional races, there are several congressional races where the margin was under 5% in 2018. And then layering on top of that, on top of those margins in the head-to-head within the congressional districts, there are certain congressional districts where in 2018, Beto O'Rourke and other statewide candidates were able to carry the congressional district themselves at the top of the ticket, but the down-ballot candidates in those congressional races did not prevail. But at the same time had very close margins. So overall, this picture of Texas has brought newfound interest from national groups, including the National Democratic Party. The DCCC, or the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, has actually set up a sort of satellite branch or crew, if you will, a staff in Texas to focus on 5 races in particular, I believe they're targeting. Texas 10 is among those. That is the race that I was working last time around for eventual nominee Mike Siegel, nominated for the Democratic Party. And there's other races, including Texas's 24th congressional district. And in Texas's 24th congressional district, I believe it's currently represented by Kenny Marchant. And then there's also Texas's 22nd district. The 22nd district is very interesting insofar as Pete Olson, the Republican incumbent, has just resigned just this past week, actually, I believe. Texas 22 is centered in Fort Bend County, which is just southwest of Harris County in the Houston area. And it's actually one of the most diverse counties, if not the most diverse county in the country. I think it's definitely the most diverse county in Texas. So the 22nd congressional district could represent a huge opportunity for Democrats or the left. On Texas's 24th district, I mentioned that one a second ago, it was Kenny Marchant, who's in that one, based out of Coppell. That's in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, also a booming metroplex with an increasingly diverse population. And so the story, I mean, to me, and there's several other districts that fit this mode that I'm talking about, where the margin was very, very low. Texas's diversity from the perspective of sort of the left or even liberals has been seen as its kind of path to victory, that there are a lot of working class people here, a lot of people of color, and from lots of different backgrounds, that if they could be united in some sort of like cohesive coalition to vote for a party, it should be easy to flip a lot of these seats and maybe even flip the state as a whole, which is something that the D-Trip is definitely interested in, and I think a lot of people are interested in, across the spectrum of the very broadly speaking, the left in America, if you will. If you guys want to put air quotes around that in your head, then you'll know what I'm talking about.
There's certainly a lot to kind of riff off there, and certainly a lot of kind of things that I think to some degree could use a little kind of explanation, a little bit of a kind of extrication of terms and whatnot. I think it's definitely sort of important because it seems like there are two kind of projects going on simultaneously, and there's this kind of idea of the Democratic Party believing largely that they can kind of flip the state blue. But then I think there's a larger and kind of more cohesive project among kind of a rising independent left that is kind of organizing outside of the Democratic Party, or wants to organize outside the Democratic Party to build sort of like a kind of mass movement that kind of exist on its own terms rather than essentially for electoral politics. And, I think trying to understand those two things in tandem, I no longer consider myself really part of a Democratic Party. I tend to that doesn't mean I'm ever going to vote for I can't see any scenario where I vote for a Republican. Right. But, just in terms of people want to know what works. And I think that there's also a sense of urgency generally, that people believe, for instance, rightly so, in that we have to address things such as climate change in a very sort of authoritative way that I don't think I've seen at least a lot of kind of momentum, especially from we're talking about the DCCC, which in some ways has been taken this sort of line toward incumbents and whatnot.
Right,
right. Maybe talk a little bit about that, but yeah, I think there's going to be sort of a lot of kind of push and pull as to what is the correct strategy to build a mass movement that can truly address the true emergencies, the true kind of national emergencies with regard to housing and healthcare and climate change that is causing such desperation right now. Yeah,
that you're absolutely right. I wanted to throw in real quick that Texas's 31st congressional district, where it was only separated by 2%, is also in that earlier grouping I was talking about. But in terms of what you're speaking on is really crucial to understand about, I think, Texas, but also about the New American Left and about the Democratic Party, is that where you find a lot of the grassroots vibrancy and a lot of the best ideas, the most inspiring candidates, and frankly, a lot of the greatest enthusiasm is among this sort of new insurgent, very passionate array of left-wing groups that include groups like the Democratic Socialists of America, as well as just a host of groups that are kind of organizations fighting around specific issue areas. And I think that's overarchingly what kind of drives this new left insurgency is a deep affinity for people and issues rather than parties or candidates. And so from that perspective, for a lot of these groups, like DSA in particular, elections and electing candidates is just one tactic within the purview of a larger campaign, the campaign being to accomplish movement on a specific issue or for a specific group of people or population, or more broadly to accomplish and build socialism in our lifetimes. So for myself, I consider myself a socialist within the Democratic Party. I think part of this tactical approach to making change, or also just propagandizing the movement, is to create a bulwark within the Democratic Party that is a faction of socialists, if you will, fighting for socialist values, a socialist platform, and attempting to elect socialist candidates to office such that they represent that movement in a sort of propagandistic way through their campaign in order to talk to people about socialism and its ideas. And then also, once they're in office, to do things that are, more socialist. I hate to even say that, but that try to strike at the power of capital, build the power and the will or the will to power, I guess, of the of working class people and in so doing, hopefully build their capacity to continue to like build socialism for and with each other. So from that perspective, like I think that this is something that DSA and other groups have kind of been doing, is forging this faction within the party, which doesn't seek necessarily to like destroy or not destroy the Democratic Party. It's more about like what's the means to socialism in a two-party system. I think that our system presents a lot of pros and cons. It's easy to focus on the cons, but part of the pros of the two-party system is like you can kind of get in there kind of quickly. If you win a primary election with a far left candidate, with a socialist candidate, then they're going to basically capture a ton of vote share in a general election precisely because of party affinity, party loyalty, and frankly low information but high partisan voting patterns that kind of mark out our two-party system. The way that I've heard it explained before is that in our two-party system, the coalitions are formed before and not after elections, which presents really, like in a European system, coalitions are formed after elections, where you have tons of parties vying in an election, and then based on their proportional representation in parliament, that kind of dictates the arithmetic logic of how the coalitions get formed between those parties that see one another as fairly close or fairly far away politically. In the American system, you, in order to vie for power, a lot of the ways that our electoral structures are designed are very winner-take-all, so the arithmetic incentive there is for people to glom and group into these giant big tent parties, which really aren't parties. They're more like coalitions of stakeholding and interest groups that themselves and maybe another system would be independent parties. So from that perspective, in terms of like actually gaining a foothold in government, trying to affect policy, which directly affects like millions and millions and millions of working class people, forming a bulwark within the Democratic Party, a faction within it, and trying to push forward a platform as well as candidates that back that platform kind of represents like at least one tactic, perhaps not the like the primal tactic or the tactic of primacy for socialists, but one tactic. And it's also, like I've been kind of mentioning, a good way to run a campaign that speaks to people about a lot of different issues from a leftist lens. So that's kind of what we're seeing develop, not just in Texas, but across the country. I mean, I think a lot of people of varying degrees of political literacy are aware of a struggle between people like the Squad members, Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Rashida Tlaib, and people who are maybe more in the mode of Nancy Pelosi and her lieutenants in the House and stuff.
Yeah, there's certainly this kind of rift that's been developing, and I think many of the so-called quote unquote centrist Democrats, such as Pelosi, which I would consider to be very far right wing, because when you have, I mean, just the fact that that Bernie Sanders represents kind of the quote unquote the far left within our kind of boundaries of electoral systems, when essentially he's like sort of a Lyndon Johnson era sort of great society is about where his like programs fall with regard to left or right. He's
more than fair.
Yeah, basically just sort of like 60s era like social welfare program. The fact that he's considered like far left, to me, kind of anyone representing that quote unquote centrist faction within that system between like sort of center left and extreme right wing, that would kind of put you more on the right wing side. So I always like to, just to set up my own straw man and then knock it down again. Like the idea that there's a centrist wing, I think, of the Democratic Party doesn't hold a lot of water.
Well, I think that's driving. I mean, to be honest, I think that there is a rising sort of recognition of exactly what you're talking about that's driving the passion and the work ethic of a lot of the people who make up this new left, which doesn't just do electoral work, but that is, for a lot of people, part of it. When you watch, people like Pelosi or large swaths of her caucuses and factions within the Democratic delegation vote for $4.6 billion for Trump's deportation machine after they ran in 2018, almost all of them on a platform that was like basically like just one sentence, resist Trump. That was like the whole message. There wasn't really much of a platform. I mean, and often you don't like to hear shallow obstructionism as a platform from any political candidate. But if the opponent is Trump, then you're like, you know what? Okay, if all I can expect you to do is stop this guy, like that wouldn't be so bad for the next 2 and 4 years, I guess. But if they're not even going to do that, then it's going to continue to potentially alienate base voters for the party. But I'm hoping that it instead drives people equally toward a sort of a different, more passionate, more principled sort of activism and advocacy that insists on, rigorous adherence to a progressive agenda, to a leftist agenda, and a steadfast refusal to collaborate with the nascent crypto fascists that have basically taken over the executive branch in large swaths of the government, as far as it appears to me.
That kind of insurgent wing that we're seeing with regard to the quote unquote squad of Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. I'm forgetting the
Ayanna
Presley. Oh no. With regard to like that kind of rift between them and the centrist wing, I've also heard it said, I wish I could remember where I heard this. I like to give credit where I can, but that essentially like the Democratic part, the difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in some ways is like the Democratic Party has several different projects going on at the same time. Like it's several different coalitions among itself, whereas like the Republican Party, whether you have the quote unquote moderate Republicans or the kind of far right wing, more firebrand Republicans, they're all essentially they're different varying shades of the same project. Whereas with like the Democratic Party project, there's a much different kind of thing I think going on with regard to someone like Ilhan Omar than there is with Nancy Pelosi. They're representing kind of two distinct worldviews, two different sets of analyses that come with that, and two different kind of class bases, whatever sort of contradictions might exist within those two. And certainly what I would say is like the kind of two-party system in some ways has thrived in the kind of apathy. It's not necessarily that the country is divided, I think, evenly between Republicans and Democrats, but that this kind of two-party system in some ways thrives on people on people recognizing that neither party necessarily represents them in certain ways, and then just staying home and not voting. And so I think in order to sort of turn that on its head, in order to kind of bring about progressive change, it requires someone who's going to get up there and really speak to all of these kind of more progressive socialist issues. And sort of like, engage in base mobilization. That's why I think, for instance, the Bernie Sanders project is interesting, whatever criticisms I might have of Bernie Sanders. The way he's, for instance, used, from my understanding, like his voter database to turn out people like union organizing and whatnot. I think that sort of shows an engagement beyond electoral politics.
Exactly.
An engagement in something, that has kind of more potential for like movement building like that.
Yeah, you nailed it. So I don't even know where to start. I really agree with like basically everything you just said. Like, I guess from the top or from the bottom up, like it's really like Bernie. The way that I like to kind of put it is like just saying the word socialism is incredibly important. What I mean by that is that socialism is so much larger than any one person, any one movement, any one thinker, even any one place or time. It's this massive body of ideology and, historically revealed praxis and theory that once you get someone into those ideas, or at least curious about those ideas and interrogating them, then they can go from there, with their own learning, with their own praxis, bring that back into their communities, onto their shop floors. And I think that in and of itself is like as or more important than Bernie's victory or defeat in these primaries or these general elections, because and he says this consistently, without this movement behind his politics, nothing will happen anyway. And in so saying, he calls out exactly what you mentioned earlier, which is the sort of conceit of the two-party system. I mean, you have like these two parties that for like the last 30 to 40 years have mostly been about managing the increasingly perilous externalities of a rapacious global capitalism. And people have been, living with the consequences of that for a long time. People in my generation grew up in some of the most surreal and absurd consequences of this, where you have the 2008 financial crash, a war in Iraq based on complete lies, a never-ending conflict in Afghanistan against an enemy that's more concept than it is material. And so for a lot of people, we're profoundly disillusioned with this system of neoliberal, technocratically managed capitalism that just goes all over the world doing whatever it wants to do. And when you have people like the Squad and Bernie Sanders not just speaking to the symptoms, but they are giving you a pathology as a doctor would, diagnosing the illness that besets the body politic. I mean, I think that type of analysis is really important to getting people to not just participate more in formal and electoral politics, but to organize in their communities for justice and for change and for socialism. And that's what I mean, that's what I'm really excited to be seeing, is like this metastasis. I hate to use a word that refers to cancer, but like this spread from the electoral realm into these other arenas of politics that in the American mindset have like not even been considered or not been disclosed as political arenas for a long time, and are being like re-revealed as arenas for political conflict. The shop floor is a great example, and the one that you made. And so that's what I'm really excited for. I think we're seeing that in Texas, from the local level all the way up to the primaries in these congressional races. And, I hope that it continues. I mean, here in Austin, we already have at least one Democratic Socialist on our city council, Greg Kassar, shouts out to him. And, have we been able to establish a socialist utopia in Austin? No, not quite, as I look around, like not there yet. But we've been able to do some pretty incredible things that capture people's imagination and really, like, I hope open a small window for them into seeing what is possible in the future.
Some of the local struggles, I think, around first paid sick leave and later the homes not handcuffs campaigns, really trying to change city policy, I think have revealed that sort of divide in sort of the internal politics of a city that likes to pride itself on progressive. I think it might be a little out of the scope of this conversation, but it's always, like, to me, I will be kind of covering that, in other episodes with other organizers, that sort of, like, especially the fallout from the homes not handcuffs, as we've seen state repression in certain ways coming from like the state level of Texas, and then of course the kind of local petty bourgeois elements to but
I think there are national corollaries in a certain way, like the policy debates that we're having about Medicare for all and the Green New Deal, which put forward like in and of themselves put forward like a vision of a different society. That's a really ambitious way to describe two proposals that on their own would not abolish capitalism, but they speak to a really directly socialist ethos, like the decommodification of an entire major national industry in the form of Medicare for all. Really, I hope forces people to reimagine what the economy should be, what it could look like. And then the Green New Deal, you're talking about similarly, potentially the transformation of a major national industry, and hopefully the socialization of it, as well as a jobs guarantee, meaning that, we as a society conceive of a way to make sure that every single person like has the means to survive, and not like as a matter of like their sort of ascertained value to some capitalist or other, but because they're a human being.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to now turn to some of the actual local races and see where these, same kind of political strands materialize in the local levels. I know we had plenty kind of on our docket that we want to discuss. Are there any in particular that kind of stand out to you as like this is sort of the example par excellence of sort of the rift in the like that sort of like those two strands within the Democratic Party and sort of how that organizing plays out against perhaps a Republican incumbent or otherwise entrenched conservative Democrat?
Yes, the answer is yes, Brian. I do have some examples. So we mentioned earlier, like, that I used to work for Mike Siegel. I'm not on his campaign now, but I guess in the interest of full disclosure, my union, United Professional Organizers, still represents staff on his campaign. And I think that his race, in Texas's 10th congressional district, really represents a lot of what we've just been discussing about this sort of new and resurgent left, as well as the external conflict between terrible Republicans and the internal conflict between less than faithful or progressive Democrats in these primary elections. So his congressional district, the 10th congressional district, is a massive gerrymandered piece of geography that stretches from northern Austin into Pflugerville and then sweeps to the south and to the east all the way into Harris County, encompassing 9 counties in between, counties like Lee County, Austin County, we've got Bastrop County in there, just like, a bunch of counties in Texas that represent a lot of Texas, frankly, rural areas that have more diverse populations than you would think they would have. Often, double-digit percentages of both Black and Latino people, Latinx people in these districts. You're seeing like industry is kind of like faltering, especially under the trade wars. You've got pollution in a lot of these communities from outsourced chemical industrial processes from the population centers. Infrastructure is not doing so great, especially with the closing of rural hospitals. And you have a candidate, Mike Siegel. All right, he runs in 2018. That's when I was working on his campaign, and he's a former union organizer, former public school teacher. He became a civil rights attorney, and then was hired by the city of Austin some time ago, to be a city attorney who helps defend Austin's like somewhat progressive, pro civil rights stuff against state countersuits and preemption. And then he runs for Congress, and he runs against Mike McCall. Mike McCall is like almost the perfect epitome of the neoliberal new consensus national security Republican, like the post-2001 Republican. Michael McCall had sat on that seat since 2003 when it was first gerrymandered for him to sit there. He had been until 2018 when the House did flip, despite him not winning, him not losing. The House did flip in 2018, but up until that point, he had been the chair of the Homeland Security Committee for near on a decade or for quite some time. So this guy presides over, completely unaccountable drone programs and all kinds of mayhem in the House of Representatives as a Republican. He was and remains one of the richest men in Congress, a multi $100 millionaire. Mike challenged him, and the district is the type of district that up until 2018 had been lost by 20 points and more by Democrats whenever they challenged this Republican. Mike Siegel cut this district to under 5 percentage points. And it wasn't just Mike Siegel. I mean, it was all the people who voted for him, all the people who volunteered for him, all the people who work for him. I'll pat myself on the back real quick. But, he ran on a platform of unabashed, progressive, pro-working class, pro-people politics on the Green New Deal, on Medicare for All, on the Employee Free Choice Act, on dignity and justice for migrants, in a district that is mostly rural Texas, and did better than any Democrat has done since the district has been drawn, basically. Since the district has existed in its current incarnation, no Democrat has done better than Michael Siegel in that district in 2018. And we did this by, one, speaking to our principles and to a coherent vision of American society in a way that, perhaps other candidates or even the party in general is sometimes unwilling to do, but also by focusing on base building and field or community organizing. An immense amount of our resources were just put into getting people knocking on doors, calling phones, and texting phones to tell people about the candidate, his platform, what it would mean for their communities, and why they should vote for him. It's how he won the primary, yes, with a runoff, and it's how he cut this district to under 5% in the general election against a multi-term, multi-incumbent, extremely wealthy Republican who represents sort of the consensus of his own party and was seen as one of the safest people in Congress. Well, I don't know about one of the safest in Congress, but an incredibly safe seat in an incredibly safe state. We'll say that. So when you cut a race by over 15 percentage points, that's going to completely change the perception of that race. So now the Texas 10th Congressional District has been named a very, very early, this is public, has been named publicly by the DCCC as a very early target that they want to try to flip going into 2020. And it's also meant, of course, that other people likewise have the same sort of, opportunistic view of the district and now want to run in it. So where you have this left-winger sort of candidate in Mike Siegel with a background in community organizing, union organizing, and civil rights law, now among his challengers, you have sort of the more center-right wing of the party well represented in the form of Shannon Hutchison. I can go into the contrast there if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just kind of make the quick kind of punctuation that, of course, I think that what you just described really, I think, goes to kind of one of my more kind of overarching political theses that, first of all, Texas is not a regressive or a backward state. It's really, it's a state with so much voter repression and so much desperation that people don't show up and vote, because for various reasons they haven't thought that either the party represents them. I think for kind of very good reason. And now that, now that I think that is shifting to a large degree, where kind of the Overton window among the Democratic Party is at least opened up at these local levels with candidates like Mike Siegel, and because people, because more organizers, I think, are wanting to be engaged with this sort of like a kind of broadly speaking, a left platform. You're like that I think is what's closing the gap, and now I'd love to get into what is going, like this kind of opportunism and what I see to be kind of a losing platform if the kind of this kind of center right wing sort of tries to come in and like swoop up all these gains. I don't think they have. Like, I don't think they'll be able to coast to victory. What they want to do is ride the coattails, I think, of the organizers who are on the ground, and then come in and come in and sort of like replace the sort of like that progressive instinct with just, well, we're blue and we're here,
right?
And I think if that comes to pass, I think that will undo all of that gains. But I'm curious as to what your thoughts are, and let's go into his challenger a little bit as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy. So, I mean, at the top, I think that you're right. Like, people think that Texas is a regressive state, but like, there's been several memes floating around about Texas in the South. It's like they more or less say, like, Texas isn't a regressive state. It's a state where working class people and progressive organizations are held hostage by extremely reactionary state governments that engage in voter suppression and other forms of basically soft political terrorism to stop people from voting. And then, but the other side of that is exactly what you mentioned that earlier about the two-party system, that since the third way ascendancy within the Democratic Party in the late 80s and early 90s, a lot of working class people, a lot of people of color have felt that the Democratic Party doesn't actually represent their core interests or their perspective with a lot of faith and fidelity, and that their platform doesn't, that the Democratic mainstream platform since that time hasn't, doesn't really offer them enough to get out and vote, or to believe that, voting for Democrats, just any Democrat, will result in the type of systemic change in our society that would actually improve things at the root of problems that have remained pervasive. So that's a really important thing for this insurgent left to be doing, and that it has been doing. You mentioned earlier that Bernie is kind of maybe more comparable to an LBJ or an FDR, but even that poll in our politics has been lost since the 90s, where you have Democrats embracing things like the omnibus crime bill, welfare reform, austerity, and more or less kicking unions to the curb, not standing up for their rights. We've watched the NLRB and the Supreme Court utterly destroy labor rights, not even just in the Trump administration, but going back again once again to the 90s. So when you have candidates like the Squad, like Mike Siegel, representing transformative platforms and policies, that's what galvanizes people. It makes people feel like this candidate and their platform, and even the party that may be backing them up, can represent a real point of inflection and a point of departure from a broken and dysfunctional status quo that disproportionately harms people of color, working class people, and other people who've been sort of socially marginalized or oppressed. So, and that's part of why I said that I thought Texas 10 really represented this well, is because you have this left-wing candidate that did a ton of work in 2018, that nearly won the district, in a district that they weren't supposed to win, but for a lot of reasons is kind of representative of Texas. You have these big urban centers at the east and western pole of the 10th district, but in between you have a lot of rural area with a lot of working class people. And then after he and his movement and his voters and his volunteers do all of this work to demonstrate that this progressive movement and vision of society can carry these districts and defeat incumbent Republicans, you have, a center right-wing person who may not even have been a Democrat, much less a progressive or a leftist throughout their life, just try to waltz in to the primary and like you said, more or less coast to victory in that district on the basis of the work already done and on the basis of sort of low information, high partisan voting patterns. Shannon Hutchison is as opposite Mike Siegel in a lot of ways as one could be, almost like if I had written a movie script and the two characters were foils, like they would be they'd be well matched in that regard. She's an employment defense lawyer. I assume a lot of your listeners know what an employment defense lawyer is, but it basically means someone who is an enforcer for the bourgeoisie, someone who defends large companies and corporations against employment law claims of discrimination and other things like that. That's how she has made her money and her way in the world, is stopping people from getting justice or getting their due, and more or less keeping the system of robust corporate power and impunity in place and enforced through the courts, which has also, of course, personally enriched her. I think that if you look into the person's background, platform is incredibly important, but like if you want to get a sense of where someone's political priorities lie, it's like their long-term commitment to a movement or an ideology multiplied by or taken in sum with where they're getting their money from and who their donors are. Mike Siegel has like almost all small dollar donations or donations from progressive groups, and much of Shannon Hutchison's money just comes from deep-pocketed individuals. And this really goes to something that we should have been, maybe talking about the national level, like when we talk about this rift, it's not just ideological. There's like a hard mechanical element to it that has to do with money. Where do the party and the candidates get its money from, and therefore, whose interests do they serve in the policies that they support? And I think that's like a key difference between the faction that I've been describing of left-wing and leftist and socialist people who want to be involved in the Democratic Party to actually make change for the working class, and people who want to do it, I don't know, just for power or to manage capitalism or to be in office or whatever. I mean, at the end of the day, where a lot of those people are getting their money from are the same places Republicans get it. Large financial institutions, private prison lobbies, all kinds of crazy stuff like that. I shouldn't say crazy. All kinds of extremely corrupt and right-wing sources of dark money. Even oil and gas companies. That's a huge issue in the Texas Democratic Party, frankly, is like, are candidates and is the party going to get money from oil and gas companies, or are we actually going to save our planet from climate change? So, when it comes to Hutchison, I just mentioned the private prison industry. If you want to get a sense for who this person is, who's running for the Democratic Party's nomination for Congress as their first foray into electoral politics, this person, Shannon Hutchison, as lately as 2018, represented a private detention facility guard. This detention facility guard had already pled guilty to 8 or more counts of sexual assault of detained women at T-Don Hutto. That's not too far from here, folks. That's up in Taylor. And it was a huge scandal, I believe, when allegations of sexual assault by those guards against those detained and extremely vulnerable women started coming out. So one of them pled guilty to over 8 counts of the same. And, predictably, they were sued in civil court following that. The ACLU actually took the case on behalf of several of the defendants. And Core Civic, or previously known as Correction Corporations of America, which operates T-Don Hutto, their in-house corporate counsel couldn't represent the guard and the company at the same time while both were getting sued for their sexual assault of migrant women. So Shannon Hutchison to the rescue. Shannon comes in and she represents the already pled out guard against these, allegations of, against the civil suit resulting from the sexual assault. So when you have someone who defends it's like, I feel like it's the title of an Onion article, like a private prison company guard engages in sexual assault, and then the person who defends them in court wants to be a Democratic nominee in a swing district in 2020. Is that how we win in Texas? Like, that alienates everybody. Okay, yeah. Nobody likes that. No, when I say those words, and it's true, I can't make that kind of thing up. I mean, it'd be disgusting if I did, but it's so absurdly horrific that I couldn't make it up if I tried. I can't think of anybody that doesn't alienate, except extreme ideological right-wingers who will never, ever vote for a Democrat.
Yeah, exactly. There's no kind of middle ground. Like in this case, there's not any kind of middle ground of people who are going to all of a sudden shift to. I mean, because for all intents and purposes, like those people who are conservative right now, they're not they're not concerned with the lesser evil. They've kind of gone full in for the greater evil, right?
Right. Well, I mean, and the other thing is like these contradictions in terms of like the movements and the economic enterprises that these candidates participate in and where it is that they get their money from. These things translate into policy. Like Shannon Hutchison, I believe it was like on Twitter yesterday, like made a comment that made it sound like she wasn't in favor of $15 minimum wage, that she was only in favor of like living wage adjustments based on cost of living, and that like it should be $12 here in Austin or some weird thing like that. And like there's no, declaration of support for Medicare for all or for the Green New Deal or for these major pieces of legislation that would actually, overhaul our society, wouldn't abolish capitalism, but would put us a lot closer to, a society where working class people's dignity and justice and well-being is actually considered. So these sort of like political and class contradictions in these candidates, they translate directly to platform and that person's like fidelity to the Democratic base, which in my mind remains the working class. Putting candidates like this up there who like don't speak to people's lived experience, don't speak to their actual like real material interest, and like have a denoted public history of opposing their interests is going to have like one predictable consequence, and that is going to be to depress the turnout of the people and the demographic groups that the Democratic Party and any progressive party would need to win, especially against a well-funded Republican incumbent.
Yeah, and to some degree, I think that particular faction of the Democratic Party has made it clear that they would rather lose with a center-right candidate than win with a progressive candidate. That they would rather, like it almost like sort of the boxer that's paid to lose the match and whatnot. So I'd like to, maybe turn to a couple other local races, and of course you can comment on that if you'd like as well. Let's go to maybe District 25. I know
that's a really exciting one.
Yeah, I was recently talking with another organizer who was talking about Heidi Sloan's entrance into that. Another Democratic socialist who has really, kind of done a lot of work with regard to like these local campaigns we're talking about, the paid sick leave and the homes not handcuffs. And I think that sort of like putting the work in on the ground first, where you get your kind of start as the sort of on the ground organizer, and then you take that into the electoral realm in order to, in order to kind of bring this platform to more of a national prominence is along the same kind of line of what we're talking about. I'm wondering, if you can just talk generally to this particular race, sort of, what the district is like, who the incumbent is, and, what people can kind of expect to see out of this. Yeah.
So Texas's 25th congressional district is really exciting. The Republican is Roger Williams, who is like in a lot of ways kind of similar to McCall, who's been there for a long time. He's more of like your sort of run of the mill. Well, I mean, none of these Republicans are run of the mill anymore. I mean, they all are collaborating with this like Trumpist fascist thing we have going on. He's been a terrible person in office for a really long time, an enemy of working people, an enemy of basically any progressive policy objective you could kind of think of. The 25th congressional district, I believe, goes north from here into like Copperas Cove and areas like that. But I could pull it up on the map real quick if you want. It's also it encompasses a big chunks of like eastern Travis County, although like what I would call like central and southeastern Travis County. So yeah, it's like it goes north from like the Austin area. It gets some of San Marcos, actually, going a little bit southeast, but then it goes all the way up to southern Fort Worth, basically, into areas like Stevensville and Cleburne. So you have in the primary, you have Julie Oliver, who ran in 2018, and then you have, she's being challenged in the primary by a really inspiring, really, really cool candidate, Heidi Sloan. Heidi Sloan is an organizer and longtime worker at Mobile Loaves and Fishes, and also does work through that under that aegis, I should say, in the Community First villages, just like helping people get food and housing and employment. I mean, she's basically like a service worker for the working class in the nonprofit realm. And then, but also she's been a longtime organizer and leader in the Democratic Socialists of America chapter here in Austin. And her leadership and her work was really instrumental on several key fights, including paid sick days, where she was a huge force to be reckoned with. The same goes for Homes Not Handcuffs, where she could speak and organize with like a really deep eloquence and experience base from her work. And so she's been doing a lot of work in Austin and the greater Travis County area to get these movements gestating on the ground and in communities through base building, community organizing, and that work has been translated to success, of course, at City Hall. And then the district, while it was cut to a really manageable margin in 2018. In order to really drive turnout in 2020 and to maximize chance of victory, a candidate like Heidi, who has that community organizing background and a really robust faith and fidelity to like the working class and its platform, is going to, I think, be able to drive turnout in some of these areas where people just respond to that more. For her part, Oliver is like, I think she's an attorney who works for like a private hospital management company or something. Like, I think in terms of platform, Oliver has been all right. And I think she's embraced Medicare for all and the Green New Deal. Although those may have caveats on them. I haven't gone back and looked in a little while. But, and frankly, I mean, anyone can say anything. I think it's pretty clear that Heidi has really put forward the commitment and the work on the ground on the issues and not just on her own electoral prospects. And she's got a really powerful movement behind her in terms of there's a lot of people who know her and know her work. Although the same could probably be said of Oliver, given that she ran in 2018. There's going to be, lots of Democratic groups and activist groups, more like the clubs and local chapters that will probably have a lot of loyalty, frankly, to the 2018 nominee. So this one is a little bit different because in this case, like what we were discussing earlier with Siegel, it's like you have this notion that like these progressives, grassroots candidates, maybe, not super well funded, or they get their funding ragtag from like small dollar donors in a really sort of like clean, people powered way. They run in 2018, they almost win. And then in 2020, okay, all of a sudden, all the big institutional players within the larger kind of scene look at these races and say, oh, now they're winnable. Okay, well, let me put someone in. This is kind of like a different case where like Oliver was kind of in like what I would call like a center left lane last time around. She wasn't running as a full blown socialist, but she was like running to the left of a lot of the mainstream party in 2018, embracing more of the Our Revolution or DSA sort of oriented like moderate left platform stuff like that we've been talking about in terms of Medicare for all. But at the same time not going like full blown DSA the way that Heidi is, which I think will actually be better. I think overall, and this goes back into your analysis about the two-party systems and the way that they encourage apathy, especially since third way ascendancy in the 80s and 90s, is that people actually want a really strong political and rhetorical departure from the status quo. And I think that like going out and saying like, I am a socialist who will radically change the way American economy and society works is like what you ought to be saying to get the most people to vote. Because if you're not saying that, then you're either saying I'm a technocratic neoliberal who will just manage capitalism until we all burn to death, or you're saying I'm a Trumpist, right? Like I will change American society and economy, but it's going to be this like crypto-fascist nightmare. So, in this, I think that it's status quo versus a new vision, and so you can either present status quo, you can present new vision right or new vision left, and new vision left is like the way to win, but the way to win and then actually like bring about justice and peace and security and everything for working class people. So I think that from that perspective, Heidi's going to have a really tough fight on her hands, given that Oliver was the nominee in 2018. But on the other hand, I think that arguably her general election prospects are better, and I think that her platform, as well as her fidelity to the principles that underlie that platform, is stronger, and that's an important thing to consider.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm looking at the Julie Oliver page right now. For various reasons, I'm obviously not endorsing or kind of anti-endorsing. To take a page from Bernie, I'm not anti-endorsing anybody either. But just kind of like looking at sort of like what's like. It's so important, I think, to understand what sort of like classes and what sort of moneyed interest, and because even within the quote the bourgeoisie, even within the group of people we would recognize as like the bourgeoisie, the business owners, the captains of industry, the Jeff Bezos and whatnot, there are still different factions at play. Like the health insurance lobby, the kind of health insurance companies are not going to have the same platform as like the oil companies, even though they're both ultimately regressive for society. There are different factions within that. So like just trying to break down who's represented by what, or who is representing what is always in ways important. But yeah, I'm looking at not to single Julie Oliver out per se, but just to understand like where people are coming from. She does not have on her website a platform page or an issues page. There's the volunteer store, the store is coming soon, events, and about Julie. And there's a very kind of personally compelling story here. But then, where are the issues? And so we have, if we need to restore, our democracy, this is from the page. If we have to restore, or if we're going to restore our democracy, we have to end the corrupting influence of big money. Well, but what does that mean? Like, it's true, but so
this is a classic this is a classic problem where like you have a movement of like people, of the people, the masses, the working class people and their allies, like making real analysis and real demands on the system, and those movements drive enthusiasm for a range of tactics, including elections. And then you have people who they just really want to be in office or whatever it is that's actually driving them. So they'll do this sort of it's what Kissinger referred to as constructive ambiguity. And I'm not a big fan of Kissinger, so I'm not really a big fan of constructive ambiguity. But the point is really what should be called a strategic ambiguity. The point is to not put up a platform. MJ Hagar in Texas's 31st congressional district is also really famous for this. She was running for Texas's 31st back in 2018. Now she's running for Senate. I don't know if she had a platform up when she was running for 31, and she doesn't have one up now, and same evidently with Julie Oliver. So, like, what is the point of this strategic ambiguity? It's because it becomes a mirror. You look at it and you see what you want to see. If you're, a center-left Democratic precinct chair who really, believes in the movement but has a little bit of naivete about them, about how politics work and about where people get their money and how to, trust and evaluate candidates, then you might look at that and you read into that what you would want to see. Like, oh, this person, they stand with me. They represent the values that I represent. Therefore, they must support all these policies and platforms that I know would have progressive outcomes. But that's not the commitments that they're saying on their website or in their public media. Instead, if you're a donor who, if you're like a Goldman Sachs banker, you help manage their PAC on Goldman Sachs's electoral board or whatever that, however they manage their PAC money or whatever, sort of finance association PAC they're funneling money into, you can look at that and be like, okay, well, this person really knows how to sleekly package themselves and not make too many commitments to these angry, rabble-rousing proles. So they're, I can invest in this person, and they can be a perfect vehicle to maintain a system that benefits me and hurts other people. So like I said, this strategic ambiguity is about making sure that you don't make any commitments, that you can't be called a liar later when you fold on what you're saying you're going to do, but so that people have nothing to hold you accountable for in an election, but at the same time, you're not saying anything that people could construe as like maybe directly opposed to some pet issue or important platform item that they really care about. So you see this a lot. To be really honest with you, you see this a lot with a lot of the center-right or right-wing Democratic candidates. They're not making any policy commitments publicly because they don't want to. They don't want to do that because if they do that, The way that they're looking at it is basically like there's a bunch of donors, and the donors have interests that are different from the base. They don't want to alienate the donors by saying something, by endorsing some policy that would hurt that person's very complex, very entrenched fiduciary interests. But they don't want to say, they fail to support that policy because then it could lose them some big tentpole group within the Democratic coalition in the context of a primary. So it's not surprising at all that, a bunch of these people don't have platforms. It's convenient. It's like a political strategy in terms of how they're running their campaign.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that's becoming clearer to people as as the sort of class contradictions in U.S. society become more stark. Is that people want to see something? I mean, I think that the gold standard for this, the thing that, that's not to say that like one of these issues is necessarily more important. Like for me, the other side of that I don't see even from so much of the progressive wing that I believe to be absolutely indispensable is like tackling the military industrial complex. But the kind of gold standard at the moment for the thing that is like that you have to be able to articulate a policy position on would be the Medicare for all. And we see that if you can't kind of say whether you're for or against Medicare for all, or if you try and do Beto's Medicare for America or what.
Oh, God. It's so disgusting.
And it's becoming, I think, more clear to sort of the person who doesn't kind of like follow politics, every day, the way like us media personalities are. It's becoming more.
I love the way the Medicare debate is going. It's going so well for us. Like that's one where we're just crushing it. Like we've made Medicare for all the standard, and we've made the main sort of 5 platform points of it like pretty clear to most people. Like everybody gets covered free at the point of service. And, this system will phase out private insurance within like 5 to 10 years or whatever. And then what does that make the centrists or the center-right Democrats do? They have to come up with plans that like explicitly preserve the private insurance company and tell people that. And people hate it. It's awesome. I love watching them squirm. And they come up with these lies like 180 million Americans love private insurance. It's like, no, they don't. They hate it. And they have to have it or they'll die. And they hate that like they're basically being like bilked out of all these like premiums over and over again just so that they're like whole teams of adjusters whose job it is to make sure that they never get paid out and that they do in fact die whenever they get sick no matter how much money they paid in. People hate private insurance in this company, and the fact that like we've risen the contradiction to the point where like people like Kamala Harris and Beto O'Rourke have to come out with like explicit plans that preserve a role and a profit share and a market share for private insurers and tell people that that's what they're doing. It forces people to say, why? Why do you care so much about the well-being of these vulture capitalists instead of just like regular people who die every day in the wealthiest country on earth because they can't get basic healthcare, not even like quality healthcare or boutique healthcare, because they can't get like basic healthcare, like dental and mental healthcare and checkups and OBGYN coverage. Like, why do you care so much about making sure that a small cabal of like extremely wealthy people continue to be extremely wealthy and make their money on the suffering of others? Why is that so important to you? And it begs so many questions about our political system because, of course, the answer is like, well, these people bankroll large chunks of my campaign or the party apparatus that I think is like necessary to get me elected. So I don't want to upset them. So here's my, half measure that keeps them rich and keeps them powerful and hopefully doesn't, tip the apple cart too hard. And people hate that. And I love to see it. People like simple, straightforward, but most importantly, transformative policy. Like it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the struggle politically and ideologically is really like, are we going to maintain a broken status quo that is pushing our world toward ecological collapse and great power conflict? Or are we going to look at a different, more collaborative, cooperative way to manage our political and economic affairs to the benefit of the many and not the few? And if you're not coming with that level of analysis, you're going to just fall back into the two-party malaise that has denoted our system for at least since the 80s and 90s, and especially in the South. I can't stress that enough, that like these problems sort of in the apathy felt toward our two-party system are really magnified in the South. And in the South also, because people are struggling under extremely reactionary state governments, if you're not presenting and articulating a vision of a different system, a vision of a new and more just society, people are going to be turned off or less than enthused, they won't show up in the numbers that you need, and you will continue to lose.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on, and so many really good points to kind of think about. I'd love to talk more about this next time we're able to do a segment like this. But for now, we have to go ahead and wrap it up. We were joined by Jacob Aronowitz, who is a DSA member as well as an organizer with United Professional Organizers and Collective Campaigns. Thank you very much, Jacob, for coming back on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure, Brian.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also available as a podcast on Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.